Evening light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Michael Chang's penthouse apartment on the 45th floor of downtown's most prestigious building. The 52-inch television mounted on the wall displayed a news report that made Michael pause mid-sip of his aged whiskey. The reporter's voice filled the room with disturbing details about widespread discrimination in high-end restaurants against homeless individuals. If you love your family and want to listen to amazing and shocking stories, click on subscribe and avoid 20 years of bad luck in your life. Michael placed his crystal glass on the marble countertop, his reflection in the polished surface showing a furrowed brow. At 45, he'd built his restaurant, the Golden Pearl, from the ground up into a 5-star establishment. The news report hit too close to home. There had been whispers about similar issues in his own restaurant, but he'd dismissed them as competitive gossip. His phone buzzed with messages from his PR team, already preparing statements to distance the Golden Pearl from such practices. Michael ignored them, instead pulling up his restaurant's recent reviews. Among the usual praise for the exquisite food and ambience, he noticed a pattern he'd overlooked before: comments about the exclusive atmosphere and carefully curated clientele, euphemisms that suddenly took on a darker meaning. The next morning, Michael called an emergency meeting with his management team. The conference room, with its sweeping city views and leather chairs, filled quickly with his 6 senior managers. They arrived carrying tablets loaded with profit reports and expansion plans, their designer suits and polished shoes reflecting the restaurant's upscale image. "What are your thoughts on our customer service policies?" Michael asked, studying their reactions carefully. The responses were telling. Marcus, his head of operations, immediately launched into a discussion about maintaining their prestigious reputation. Sarah from marketing emphasized the importance of their target demographic. Not one person mentioned inclusivity or ethical treatment of all potential customers. As the meeting progressed, Michael noticed how every suggestion circled back to profit margins and brand image. When he brought up the recent news about discrimination in the industry, his team's responses were dismissive. "Our clientele expects a certain environment," Marcus said, adjusting his Italian silk tie. "We have to protect our brand." Later that afternoon, Michael overheard a conversation between 2 junior managers near the service entrance. They were discussing a new unofficial policy of discouraging undesirable elements from entering the restaurant. The words made his stomach turn. This wasn't the vision he'd had when he'd opened the Golden Pearl 15 years ago. That evening, alone in his office, overlooking the city lights, Michael made a decision. His team's responses and the whispered conversations in the hallways confirmed his suspicions. There was something wrong with his restaurant's culture, and standard management approaches wouldn't reveal the truth. He needed to see it firsthand, from the other side. Opening his laptop, he began researching method acting techniques and consulting photos of homeless individuals in the city. He studied their clothing, mannerisms, and common behaviors. His plan was forming. He would become one of the very people his restaurant might be discriminating against. Michael knew the risks. If word got out that a successful CEO was masquerading as a homeless person, it could become a PR nightmare. But as he looked at his own reflection in the window, he realized he no longer recognized the culture of the restaurant he'd built. Something had changed while he wasn't watching, and now he needed to understand exactly what his creation had become. He marked his calendar for the following week, clearing his schedule under the pretense of a business trip. His personal assistant raised an eyebrow at the sudden change but asked no questions. Michael spent the next few days gathering what he'd need: worn clothes from a thrift store, makeup to alter his appearance, and a backstory that would hold up under scrutiny. The transformation from CEO to homeless person proved more challenging than Michael anticipated. Standing in front of his bathroom mirror, he applied spirit gum to attach the fake, unkempt beard he'd purchased from a theatrical supply store. His usually perfectly styled hair was now deliberately disheveled, grayed with temporary color. The designer clothes were replaced with layers of worn, stained garments from various thrift stores. The final touch was a light coating of stage dirt on his hands and face. At 5:30 p.m., during the restaurant's busy dinner service, Michael approached the Golden Pearl from across the street. The familiar building looked different from this new perspective, more intimidating, almost hostile. The gleaming glass doors that he'd always seen as welcoming now seemed like barriers, reflecting the setting sun with an almost aggressive brightness. James, the doorman who had worked there for 5 years, stood at his usual post. Michael had personally hired him, appreciating his professional demeanor. Now, as Michael shuffled toward the entrance, James's expression shifted from neutral to wary. When Michael reached for the door handle, James stepped slightly to the left, creating a subtle but deliberate obstacle. "Sir, I'm afraid we're fully booked this evening," James said, his voice carrying a tone Michael had never heard before, cold, dismissive. Michael mumbled about just wanting to sit at the bar, but James's stance became more rigid. "The bar area is reserved for dining guests only." Through the glass, Michael could see several empty seats at the bar. His stomach tightened as he realized this wasn't an isolated incident. This was practiced behavior. How many others had been turned away like this? Eventually, Michael managed to slip inside during a busy moment when James was distracted by a group of well-dressed patrons. The interior of his restaurant, usually a source of pride with its crystal chandeliers and mahogany panels, now felt oppressive. The soft jazz music he'd personally selected seemed to mock the situation. At a corner table, a group of business executives were enjoying an expensive bottle of wine. One of them noticed Michael and made a comment to his companions, triggering barely concealed laughter. Michael recognized one of them, a regular customer who had always greeted him warmly as the owner. Now, the same man was making exaggerated gestures of covering his nose, encouraging more laughter from his colleagues. Michael found an empty table in a poorly lit corner. The same table he'd noticed was often empty during his regular observations as owner. Now he understood why. It was positioned far from other diners, almost hidden behind a decorative column, the perfect place to seat undesirable guests. Several servers passed by, pointedly avoiding eye contact. Michael watched as they attended 2 other tables with flourishing attention, pulling out chairs, folding napkins, describing daily specials with enthusiasm. Yet his presence remained deliberately unacknowledged. The minutes stretched uncomfortably. Michael observed other diners shooting disapproving glances his way, some whispering to their servers, likely complaining about his presence. He'd never felt more invisible in his own establishment. Then Lily appeared. Unlike her colleagues, she approached his table without hesitation. Her name tag was slightly crooked on her black uniform, and her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. What struck Michael most was her smile, genuine, reaching her eyes, devoid of the artificial customer service expression he'd seen on other staff members. "Would you like to see our menu?" she asked, already pulling one from her apron. Her voice carried no trace of condescension or discomfort. When Michael mumbled about not being sure he could afford anything, her response surprised him. "Our soup of the day is excellent, and it comes with fresh bread. Would you like to try that?" The interaction was brief but profound. In those few moments, Michael witnessed exactly what his restaurant lacked: basic human dignity extended to every guest, regardless of their appearance or perceived status. As Lily walked away to place his order, Michael noticed several other servers watching her with disapproval. She either didn't notice or, more likely, didn't care. Over the next hour, Michael observed Lily's interactions with other customers while pretending to slowly eat his soup. She moved between tables with an efficiency that spoke of years of experience, but it was her consistent kindness that stood out. Whether serving a group spending thousands on wine or bringing him a complimentary refill of bread, her demeanor never changed. During a quiet moment, Lily returned to his table. Instead of the perfunctory "is everything okay" that servers typically used, she pulled out a chair and sat down, an action that drew sharp looks from other staff members. "You remind me of someone," she said quietly. "My father used to work in finance before the market crash of '08. He spent 2 years on the streets before getting back on his feet." Michael nearly choked on his soup, worried she'd recognized him, but Lily continued, unaware of his anxiety. She shared stories about volunteering at local shelters, about the hidden population of former professionals who'd lost everything to medical bills, addiction, or economic downturns. Her words painted a picture of a world Michael had only seen in statistics and charity reports. "The restaurant industry can be ruthless," she confided, glancing around to ensure no other staff were within earshot. "There's this unspoken hierarchy. The same people who spend hundreds on a bottle of wine often complain if we serve anyone who doesn't match their expectations of what our clientele should look like." She told him about her small acts of rebellion, keeping takeout containers of leftover food that would otherwise be thrown away, organizing other servers to donate their meal allowances to local shelters, sneaking extra bread into doggy bags for people she knew would share with others on the street. "Most people don't realize how thin the line is between stability and homelessness," Lily continued. "One medical emergency, one job loss, one bad decision. That's all it takes. But my managers here," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "they don't see it that way. They're more concerned with maintaining an image than showing basic humanity." Michael watched as she excused herself to help another table. Her interaction with the wealthy couple was flawless, professional yet warm, but he noticed how the male diner barely acknowledged her presence, treating her as if she were part of the furniture. The contrast between Lily's humanity and the casual disdain she received was stark. Later, during her break, Michael observed Lily sharing her staff meal with an elderly man who had wandered in seeking shelter from the cold. She had seated him at the service entrance, away from the main dining room, and was listening intently as he showed her photos of his grandchildren from his worn wallet. The other staff members walked past this scene with various reactions. Some rolled their eyes, others pretended not to notice, and a few showed subtle signs of approval, but clearly felt unable to join in. Michael realized that Lily wasn't just an anomaly in his restaurant. She was a mirror reflecting everything that had gone wrong with the culture he'd helped create. As the evening progressed, Michael witnessed more interactions that revealed the complex social dynamics at play. Regular customers who greeted managers with excessive familiarity while ignoring servers completely. Staff members who competed for the most profitable tables while avoiding anyone who might not leave a substantial tip. And through it all, Lily maintained her quiet rebellion against the unwritten rules that prioritized profit over people. When she returned to clear his table, Lily slipped him a card with information about a local shelter. "They have a good program for job training," she said softly, "and they don't judge where you've been or what brought you there." The irony of receiving career advice in his own restaurant wasn't lost on Michael, but the genuine concern in her voice moved him deeply. As the restaurant's dinner service wound down, Michael left through the service entrance, careful to maintain his disguise. Instead of heading to his luxury car parked blocks away, he followed Lily at a discreet distance when her shift ended at 11 p.m. The night air was crisp, and the city's affluent dining district gradually gave way to less polished neighborhoods. Lily stopped at a small deli that was closing for the night. Through the window, Michael watched as she spoke with the owner, who began filling a large paper bag with unsold sandwiches and pastries. This appeared to be a regular arrangement. The easy familiarity between them suggested a long-standing partnership in food rescue. She then walked several more blocks to a small park where a group of people had gathered. Some were sleeping on benches, others sitting in small circles, sharing stories and what few resources they had. Michael hung back, blending in with his disheveled appearance, and observed as Lily approached the group. "Evening, everyone," she called out softly, beginning to distribute the food. What struck Michael wasn't just her generosity, but how she knew each person by name. "Here's your favorite," Tom, turkey on rye, and Sarah, I remembered you're vegetarian. The personal touches transformed what could have been a simple handout into something more dignified. As people ate, they shared their stories. Michael listened, each narrative hitting him like a physical blow. A former schoolteacher who'd lost everything to medical bills after her husband's cancer treatment. A young man who'd fled an abusive home and couldn't find work without a permanent address. A veteran struggling with PTSD who found traditional shelters too overwhelming. One man, probably in his 60s, showed Lily a crumpled job application. They threw it away as soon as I left, he said, his voice heavy with resignation. Saw them do it through the window. Didn't even read it. Lily sat with him, offering to help revise his resume at the library during her next day off. Michael pulled out the small notebook he'd brought along and began taking notes, his hands trembling slightly. The problems were more complex than he'd imagined. It wasn't just about providing meals or shelter. It was about rebuilding dignity, creating opportunities, challenging systemic barriers. He wrote down ideas as they came, converting the restaurant's unused basement into a training kitchen for a job program, establishing partnerships with local shelters, implementing a pay-what-you-can menu during off-peak hours. But more importantly, he documented the human stories he was hearing. Understanding the statistics and business plans couldn't capture the real impact of poverty and discrimination. As the night grew colder, Lily distributed blankets from her backpack, clearly another regular part of her routine. I'm sorry I couldn't bring more tonight, she apologized, but I'm working on convincing more restaurants in the area to donate their unused linens instead of throwing them away. Before leaving, she sat with a young woman who was new to the group. The woman was crying, describing how she'd lost her job and then her apartment within the span of 2 months. Michael watched as Lily took off her own scarf and wrapped it around the woman's shoulders, then spent time helping her navigate the complex web of social services and emergency housing options. The scene brought into sharp focus the contrast between his restaurant's extravagant waste, the uneaten bread thrown away each night, the linens replaced at the slightest sign of wear, the portions returned to the kitchen barely touched, and the basic needs going unmet just blocks away. The next evening, Michael returned to the Golden Pearl in his homeless disguise, but this time he positioned himself near the service entrance, where he could observe the management's operations more closely. The evening rush was beginning, and through the partially open door, he could hear the familiar chaos of the kitchen mixed with administrative discussions. Marcus, his head manager, was engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion with one of their longtime suppliers in the back office. Michael inched closer, careful to remain inconspicuous among the delivery trucks and waste bins. Years of restaurant experience had taught him that the real stories often emerged in these service areas, away from the polished dining room's facade. The numbers need to match exactly, Marcus was saying, his voice carrying an edge of authority that Michael had always appreciated in client interactions, but now seemed menacing. Double invoice it like last time, one for the audit and one for our actual records. The supplier, a middle-aged man named Frank who'd worked with the restaurant for years, sounded uncomfortable. This is getting complicated, Marcus. These community outreach funds are supposed to go to food banks and shelter programs. We can't keep, we can, and we will, Marcus interrupted. The owner never checks the details. He's too busy with his PR appearances and charity galas. Just make sure the paperwork looks clean. Michael felt his chest tighten. The community outreach program had been his initiative, a percentage of profits supposedly dedicated to supporting local food security programs. He'd trusted Marcus to manage the details, proud of the positive press it had generated for the restaurant. Now he understood why the impact reports had always seemed vague. Through the crack in the door, he could see Marcus pulling out a ledger, not the digital system they used for official accounting, but an old-fashioned book. As they reviewed the numbers, Michael realized the scheme's complexity. Inflated supplier invoices, phantom community partnerships, fabricated donation receipts. all designed to siphon money from charitable initiatives into someone's pocket. The conversation shifted to other aspects of the restaurant's operations. "That bleeding heart waitress is becoming a problem," Marcus said, and Michael knew immediately he meant Lily. "She's giving away too much food, letting the wrong kind of people hang around. It's affecting our image." "She's one of your best servers," Frank pointed out. "The customers love her." "The right customers don't love watching her feed strays at the service entrance," Marcus countered. "I've had complaints from premium members. We're not running a soup kitchen." The discussion revealed layers of corruption beyond the financial fraud. Marcus detailed various schemes, charging premium wine prices for mid-range bottles, marking up supplier costs while taking kickbacks, even skimming from staff tips through manipulated credit card reports. More disturbing were his plans to clean up the restaurant's image. These included stricter dress codes designed to exclude certain customers, training staff to discourage undesirable patrons from lingering, and a new surveillance system aimed more at profiling customers than security. Michael had heard enough. He pulled out his phone, carefully positioning it to record the conversation while remaining hidden. The evidence was damning, but he needed more than just snippets of dialogue. He needed the ledger, the fake invoices, the complete paper trail. As he contemplated his next move, a kitchen worker emptied some trash nearby, nearly discovering him. Michael shuffled away quickly, his mind racing with the implications of what he'd learned. The corruption wasn't just financial, it was a systematic betrayal of everything the restaurant was supposed to represent. Early Monday morning, Michael returned to his office, shedding his homeless disguise. He called an emergency management meeting, ensuring Marcus would be present. The conference room filled with tense energy as his senior staff assembled, their usual confident demeanors slightly shaken by the unexpected summons. "I've been conducting an internal audit," Michael began, watching Marcus's face carefully, particularly focusing on our community outreach programs. He pulled up a series of spreadsheets on the large screen, documents he'd spent the weekend compiling from his covert investigation. Marcus maintained his composure, but Michael noticed his left hand tightening around his leather portfolio. "Those numbers seem somewhat outdated," Marcus interjected smoothly. "I have more recent reports that show significant community impact." Michael clicked to the next slide, revealing photographs he'd taken of the falsified ledger. "Interesting, because these documents tell a very different story." The room grew uncomfortably quiet. "Would you care to explain why our food bank donations exist only on paper, or why supplier invoices are being double-billed?" Marcus's professional facade cracked slightly, but he recovered quickly. "There seems to be some misunderstanding," he said, his voice carrying a subtle threat. "These are complex accounting procedures designed to maximize our tax benefits. Nothing more. Tax benefits." Michael's voice remained calm, but his anger was evident. "Is that what we're calling fraud now?" He produced copies of the real invoices he'd obtained from Frank, who'd agreed to cooperate after being assured of immunity. Marcus's strategy shifted from denial to intimidation. "You might want to consider the implications of these accusations," he said, leaning forward. "The board won't appreciate a scandal. Your position isn't as secure as you might think." Other managers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some avoiding eye contact, others watching the exchange with barely concealed interest. Michael realized that some must have known about the corruption, while others were just learning of it now. "Are you threatening me, Marcus?" Michael asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "In my own restaurant," Marcus smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm merely suggesting that certain arrangements have become integral to our operation. Changes could be disruptive, expensive. Some board members might question your leadership if profits suddenly decline." The threat was clear. Marcus had allies on the board, people who either benefited from or turned a blind eye to the corruption. Michael had suspected as much, but hearing it stated so boldly was still shocking. "You've got nothing concrete," Marcus continued, regaining his confidence. "Circumstantial evidence, at best." And who would believe the word of a CEO who spent weeks pretending to be homeless? The press would have a field day with that story. The room tensed at this revelation. Michael hadn't told anyone about his undercover investigation, which meant Marcus had been having him watched. The implications were disturbing. How deep did the surveillance go? Who else was involved? "You're right about one thing," Michael responded, maintaining his composure. "I don't have enough evidence yet, but that's going to change." He stood, straightening his jacket. "Consider this meeting a warning, a chance to come clean voluntarily." Marcus gathered his things, his movements deliberately casual. "We'll see who needs a warning," he said quietly as he headed for the door. "Things work a certain way here now. Accept it, or prepare for a fight you might not win." As the room emptied, Michael remained seated, processing the confrontation. He'd expected denial, perhaps even some attempt at justification, but the level of entrenched corruption and the confidence with which Marcus had threatened him suggested this problem went far beyond what he'd initially discovered. That evening, Michael waited for Lily after her shift, this time in his true identity. Her surprised expression when she saw him standing by the service entrance quickly turned to understanding as she connected the dots. Between the homeless man she'd served and her CEO, "I wondered how long it would take you to notice what was happening in your own restaurant," she said, showing no sign of the deference typically displayed toward management. "Though I didn't expect such a thorough investigation method." They walked to a 24-hour diner several blocks away, where Michael laid out everything he'd discovered about Marcus's corruption. Lily listened intently, occasionally nodding as pieces of information confirmed her own suspicions. "The missing donations make sense now," she said, stirring her coffee. "I've been trying to coordinate with local shelters for months, but they never seemed to receive the supplies Marcus claimed were being sent. When I asked questions, I was told to focus on my serving duties." Michael pulled out his notebook, flipping to the pages of observations and evidence he'd gathered. "I need inside help, Lily. Marcus has allies on the board, and I suspect he has other managers involved too, but I don't know how deep it goes." Lily reached into her bag and produced her own notebook. Years of documented incidents, dates, names, and discrepancies she'd noticed. "I started keeping records when I realized food that was supposed to be donated was disappearing. I have photos too." They spent hours comparing notes, building a more complete picture of the corruption. Lily had cultivated relationships with other concerned employees, kitchen staff who tracked food waste, bartenders who noticed discrepancies in premium liquor inventory, even maintenance workers who'd observed suspicious late-night meetings. "Carlos, our dishwasher, has been here for 15 years, Lily explained. "He knows where every skeleton is buried, literally and figuratively. He's seen Marcus meeting with health inspectors in the parking lot, exchanging envelopes. Together, they developed a plan to gather more evidence. They identified key employees who might be willing to speak up, mapped out patterns of suspicious behavior, and established a secure way to communicate findings through an encrypted messaging app. We need to be careful," Lily warned. Last month, a busboy who asked too many questions about the wine inventory suddenly found himself accused of theft. He was fired immediately. No investigation. Michael realized the extent of the hostile environment his employees had been working in. "How many others have been silenced this way?" "More than I can count," Lily replied. "But some are ready to talk now. They just needed to know someone would listen and protect them." The breakthrough came when they located Jerome, a former accountant who'd worked at the restaurant for nearly a decade before being forced into early retirement. "He reached out to me last year," Lily revealed. "Said he had documentation of everything, but was afraid to come forward. He had been waiting for the right moment." Jerome's evidence proved to be the missing piece they needed. Years of meticulous records showing the systematic theft of funds, fraudulent accounting practices, and the network of conspirators involved in the scheme. As dawn approached, Michael and Lily had assembled a preliminary case strong enough to warrant a full investigation. But they also understood that presenting this evidence would trigger an aggressive response from Marcus and his allies. "We need to move quickly," Michael said, reviewing their timeline. "Marcus already suspects I'm building a case. He'll be working to cover his tracks and silence potential witnesses." Lily nodded, her expression determined. "The staff meeting tomorrow. Most of the concerned employees will be there. It's our chance to organize everyone who wants to help expose this." The next afternoon, Michael and Lily gathered a select group of employees in the restaurant's wine cellar. During the quiet hours between lunch and dinner service, the location, suggested by Carlos the dishwasher, was one of the few places not covered by Marcus's surveillance cameras. 20 employees crowded between the wine racks. Servers, line cooks, bartenders, and support staff. The fear in the room was palpable, but so was the determination. Michael watched as Lily moved through the group, quietly reassuring those who seemed most nervous. "What we're about to discuss stays here," Michael began, keeping his voice low. "Each of you has witnessed something, has evidence of wrongdoing, or has been personally affected by the corruption in our restaurant." He laid out the evidence they'd gathered, explaining how each piece fit into the larger picture of systematic fraud and intimidation. As he spoke, he could see recognition dawning on faces, individual experiences suddenly making sense as part of a larger pattern. "I was ordered to change inventory records last month," Sarah, a senior bartender, revealed. "Premium liquor bottles were being refilled with cheaper brands, but we were still charging top-shelf prices." Others began sharing their stories. A line cook described watching perfectly good food being thrown away rather than donated, despite the restaurant's public claims about food rescue programs. A host detailed how she was instructed to discriminate against certain customers, with specific code words used to alert management about undesirable patrons. But when Michael proposed their plan for collective action, the mood shifted. Tom, a veteran server, voiced what many were thinking. "Marcus has friends in corporate restaurants across the city. He'll make sure none of us ever works in fine dining again. He's already threatened my family," added Maria, a prep cook. "Said he knew where my kids went to school. I can't risk it." The fear was spreading through the group like a contagion. Michael could see their carefully constructed plan beginning to unravel as people contemplated the personal cost of standing up against entrenched corruption. That's when Lily stepped forward. "I understand your fear," she said, her voice quiet but intense. "I've worked here for 6 years. I've seen people fired for speaking up. I've been threatened myself." She paused, making eye contact with each person in the room. "But think about what our silence has cost already. Think about the people we could have helped with those stolen donations. Think about the colleagues who were fired unjustly, their reputations ruined. Think about how this place makes us compromise our values every single day." The room grew still as she continued. "Yes, Marcus has power. Yes, he has connections. But there are 30 of us, and one of him. Together, with Mr. Chang's support and the evidence we've gathered, we can end this." Michael watched as her words began to take effect. The fear was still there, but something stronger was emerging, a sense of collective purpose, of righteous anger. Carlos, who had remained quiet until now, spoke up. "My father taught me that evil succeeds when good people stay quiet. I'm tired of staying quiet." One by one, people began nodding, straightening their shoulders, finding their courage. They spent the next hour assigning roles, establishing secure communication channels, and planning how to protect their most vulnerable members. "Remember," Michael concluded, "we're not just fighting against corruption, we're fighting for the soul of this restaurant, for what it could and should be." The all-staff meeting was scheduled for 3 p.m. in the main dining room. Michael arrived early to find Marcus had already arranged the chairs theater-style, positioning himself at the front with other senior managers. A clear power play designed to intimidate. The room filled gradually, tension mounting with each arrival. Michael noticed how Marcus's allies positioned themselves strategically throughout the space, watching, noting who sat with whom, Lily and their core group of supporters dispersed themselves equally carefully, ready to support anyone who spoke up. "Thank you all for coming," Michael began, standing at the center rather than behind the podium Marcus had set up. "We're here to discuss some significant changes in how the Golden Pearl operates, particularly regarding our community engagement programs." Before he could continue, Marcus interrupted smoothly. "Actually, we have some pressing operational matters to address first. There have been concerns about inventory discrepancies and unauthorized food distribution." Michael saw several employees shift uncomfortably. It was a clear threat aimed at those who'd been helping Lily with her unofficial food rescue efforts. But before Marcus could continue his intimidation tactics, the restaurant's front door opened. A woman entered, professionally dressed, notebook in hand. "I'm sorry, I'm late," she said, taking a seat near the back. "Sarah Chen, from the Chronicle. I was told this meeting would address concerns about financial irregularities and discriminatory practices at the Golden Pearl." Marcus's composure slipped for a moment. "This is a private meeting," he snapped. "Media is not welcome. I invited her." Michael interrupted. "As I was saying, we're here to discuss changes, starting with our commitment to transparency." He launched into a presentation of their findings, watching as Marcus's face grew increasingly pale. With each revelation, the falsified donation records, the discriminatory seating policies, the supplier kickbacks, more employees began nodding, some even calling out additional examples. Marcus attempted to regain control. "These are baseless accusations. The board will never." "The board is already aware," Michael cut in. "I spoke with them this morning. They've authorized a full audit and external investigation." The reporter was writing rapidly, her presence ensuring everything said became part of the public record. Michael could see Marcus calculating his options, realizing how thoroughly he'd been outmaneuvered. Then Lily stood up. "I have something to add," she said, her voice steady. She walked to the front of the room, turning to face her colleagues. "Many of you know I've worked here for 6 years. What you don't know is why I chose this restaurant." The room grew quiet as she continued. "My father was Robert Harper, CEO of Aegis Bank before the 2008 crash. After losing everything, he spent 2 years homeless. During that time, only one restaurant in this city treated him with dignity, the Golden Pearl, under its original management. He never forgot that kindness." A murmur ran through the crowd. The Harper banking scandal had been major news, and Robert Harper's disappearance had fueled speculation for years. "When he finally recovered and rebuilt his life," Lily continued, "he invested heavily in this restaurant through a holding company. He believed in its mission. I came to work here to honor that belief, to ensure other people experiencing hardship would find the same kindness he did." Michael hadn't known this part. He watched as the implications sank in. Lily wasn't just a waitress. She represented one of the restaurant's major investors. The revelation of Lily's true identity sent shockwaves through the room. Marcus, who had spent years dismissing her as just another server, now stood frozen, realizing the magnitude of his miscalculation. The reporter from the Chronicle was furiously taking notes, clearly recognizing she had stumbled onto a much bigger story than expected. "My father's holding company controls 30% of this restaurant's shares," Lily continued, her voice gaining strength, "which means I've had the authority to request a full financial audit all along. I just needed to gather enough evidence first." Marcus made one final attempt to salvage the situation. "Whatever discrepancies exist can be explained," he said, reaching into his briefcase. "I have documentation that shows what Marcus." Michael interrupted, pulling out a small digital recorder. "The same documentation you discussed with Frank last week. Or perhaps the conversation where you threatened my position on the board." He pressed play, and Marcus's own voice filled the room, discussing the fraudulent donation schemes. The effect was immediate. Several of Marcus's allies began distancing themselves, physically moving away from him in their seats. Others started speaking up, eager to save themselves. "He made me falsify the wine inventory," one bartender admitted. "I have copies of the real donation records," a senior accountant volunteered. "I can prove the discrimination policies came directly from his office," added a host. The reporter was practically vibrating with excitement as she documented the cascade of confessions. Marcus, seeing his support crumbling, made a desperate final play. "You're all forgetting who has the real power in this industry," he snarled. "One phone call from me, and none of you will work in. That's enough." A new voice cut through the chaos. Robert Harper himself stood in the doorway, older and grayer than the photos from his banking days, but carrying himself with unmistakable authority. "I believe this meeting has served its purpose." The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Police arrived to take statements about the financial fraud. The Chronicle reporters secured exclusive rights to the story, promising to focus not just on the corruption, but on the larger issues of discrimination and social responsibility in the restaurant industry. Marcus and his closest allies were escorted from the premises. The board convened an emergency session via conference call, voting unanimously to dismiss them and cooperate fully with authorities. But the real transformation came in the days that followed. Michael and Lily, now officially recognized as co-managers, began implementing the changes they'd envisioned. The restaurant's basement was converted into a training kitchen for a culinary education program, serving homeless individuals. A portion of each day's service was reserved for pay-what-you-can meals. Food rescue partnerships were established with local shelters. The Golden Pearl's reputation changed too. Instead of being known just for its expensive menu and exclusive atmosphere, it became celebrated for pioneering a new model of social responsibility in fine dining. Other restaurants in the city began adopting similar programs, creating a ripple effect of positive change. 1 month after the confrontation, Michael stood in the dining room watching. Lily trained their first class of culinary students, former homeless individuals getting a fresh start. Among them was Tom, the elderly man they'd met in the park, now learning to be a prep cook. "You know," Lily said, joining him at the window, "my father always said that true luxury isn't about excluding people, it's about having enough to share." Michael nodded, watching the sunset reflect off the restaurant's windows. "I think we finally got it right," he replied. "This is what the Golden Pearl was always meant to be." The story made headlines across the country. 5-star restaurant serves up second chances. And from homeless to hopeful, how one restaurant changed lives. But for Michael and Lily, the real success wasn't in the headlines. It was in the simple dignity of serving everyone who walked through their doors with equal respect and kindness.